Moving into my new house was supposed to be the start of something fresh, something peaceful. I had spent years crammed into a tiny city apartment, surrounded by noise, chaos, and a never-ending parade of upstairs neighbors who apparently mistook their floor for a trampoline. The suburbs seemed like a dream come true. Quiet streets, friendly nods from neighbors, and a backyard big enough to actually stretch out in. For the first time in years, I could finally breathe. The house itself was charming, even if it had seen better days. The fence sagged in places, the garden was overrun with weeds, and the mailbox leaned so far to one side, it looked like it was whispering secrets to the grass. But I didn't mind. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. As I unpacked boxes and imagined how I'd bring the place back to life, I felt an optimism I hadn't experienced in a long time. This house was my escape, my chance to leave the stress of the city behind and start fresh. That's when I first heard about Karen. You know the type. Overly involved, always in everyone's business, and somehow convinced that her title of HOA president made her royalty. The realtor had mentioned her in passing, mostly as a warning to keep things in line. But I figured she couldn't be that bad. After all, how much trouble could one middle-aged suburbanite with a clipboard really cause? I was about to find out. The neighborhood itself was lovely, exactly what I'd hoped for. The lawns were neatly trimmed, the houses were painted in cheerful, welcoming tones, and every evening, a golden sunset bathed the street in a warm, idyllic glow. It felt like stepping into a Norman Rockwell painting, but behind the smiles and small talk, there was an unspoken undercurrent I couldn't quite place. Like everyone was watching their step around something or someone. I had barely started unpacking when Karen made her first appearance. She didn't knock, she announced herself with a voice loud enough to echo through my front door. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she chirped, though there was something sharp behind her smile, like the greeting was more of a formality than genuine warmth. As I opened the door, I was met with a woman in her late 50s, her hair a shade of blonde, that screamed salon regular, clutching a clipboard as if it were a scepter. "I'm Karen, president of the HOA," she said, her tone making it sound like a title she expected me to bow to. "Just a quick heads up, we have rules here to keep the community looking its best. I'll drop by later to go over them with you." I didn't know it yet, but that was Karen's way of saying, "I own this neighborhood and you'll play by my rules." At the time, I brushed it off, chalking it up to an overly eager neighbor with a little too much time on her hands. Little did I know, Karen wasn't just eager, she was relentless. Settling into my new home felt like a breath of fresh air. Sure, the previous owners had left the place in a state that could generously be described as neglected, but I saw it as a blank canvas. The sagging fence, a weekend project, the overgrown bushes that looked like they might actually be plotting a takeover, a chance to learn landscaping. For the first time in years, I found joy in rolling up my sleeves and getting my hands dirty. I was in the middle of planting a row of hydrangeas, my attempt at adding a splash of color to the drab yard, when it happened. The faint sound of heels clicking against the pavement made me glance up. Striding toward me was Karen, her clipboard clutched tightly, her expression teetering between overly friendly and dangerously determined. Without so much as a hello, she stopped at the edge of my property and surveyed my yard like a queen inspecting her domain. "Good afternoon," she chirped, though her tone carried all the warmth of a traffic ticket. "I noticed you've been making some changes." I straightened, brushing dirt from my hands. "Yeah, just trying to clean things up a bit." "Well," she said, narrowing her eyes at the freshly planted flowers, "I'm here to conduct a routine inspection. It's part of my role as HOA president. We need to make sure everything aligns with community standards." I blinked, caught off guard. "Inspection? I don't think that's necessary. I'm not part of the HOA. Karen's smile tightened, her eyes glinting with what I could only describe as Karen energy. "Oh, sweetheart, everyone in this neighborhood benefits from the HOA. Membership isn't really optional, and it's important that everyone plays their part." I felt my jaw tighten. With all due respect, I didn't sign any agreement when I bought this house. I'm not bound by your HOA rules. Her expression hardened. She stepped closer, clipboard raised like a shield. "It's not just about agreements, it's about maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood. I have every right to inspect your property to ensure compliance." Now, I'm not a confrontational person, but something about her tone, the audacity of it, lit a fire in me. "You don't have the right to come onto my property," I said, crossing my arms. "This is private property, and I'm asking you to leave." For a moment, Karen's face twitched, as if she couldn't quite process my refusal. "Well," she said, her voice icy, "this isn't the end of it. You'll be hearing from me." With that, she turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply as she stalked off. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell myself she was just a busybody with too much time on her hands. But the way she'd looked at me, like I was a problem to be dealt with, left a knot of unease in my stomach. The next morning, I found a bright yellow notice taped to my front door. It was printed on official-looking HOA letterhead, listing a series of supposed violations: my garden layout, the non-compliant height of my new fence, even the color of my mulch. At the bottom, in bold letters, was a warning of potential fines if the issues weren't addressed. It was laughable and infuriating. I snapped a photo of the notice and sent it to my lawyer, Carl. "Tell me this is as ridiculous as it looks," I said when he called me back. "More ridiculous," Carl replied. "She's overstepping her bounds. If you're not part of the HOA, their rules don't apply to you. She's just trying to intimidate you." Carl's reassurance should have put me at ease, but Karen's note felt like a declaration of war. She wasn't going to let this go, and I wasn't about to back down. I thought Karen's violation notice was the peak of her antics. I was wrong. Over the next few days, her behavior went from irritating to downright invasive. At first, it was subtle. Her car would slow to a crawl as she passed my house. Her phone angled suspiciously toward my yard. It didn't take a genius to figure out she was taking pictures. I waved at her once, hoping she'd realize how absurd she looked. Instead, she sped off, her face flushed with indignation. The next morning, another notice appeared on my door. This one was longer, stuffed with legal jargon and bolded warnings about non-compliance. She had added a new accusation: my lawn wasn't uniformly maintained and thus violated community standards. It was becoming clear that Karen wasn't just trying to enforce rules. She was making them up as she went along. I ignored the notice, but Karen didn't stop. She started parking across the street, idling for what felt like hours. Once, I stepped outside to water my plants and caught her snapping photos. Her attempts at stealth were laughable. She was leaning halfway out of her car window. "Can I help you, Karen?" I called, trying to keep my tone civil. She ducked back into her car and drove off without a word. It wasn't just the drive-bys and photos, though. Karen had apparently decided to turn the neighborhood against me. I overheard snippets of conversations as I walked my dog. Words like eyesore and disrupting the harmony. Neighbors who had initially greeted me with polite smiles now averted their eyes. One brave soul told me Karen had been spreading rumors that I was refusing to cooperate and bringing down property values. Enough was enough. I called my lawyer, Carl, to fill him in on the escalation. "This is starting to feel like harassment," I said, pacing my living room. "Starting?" Carl replied dryly. "It's already there. Here's what you're going to do. Install security cameras, document everything: photos, letters, timestamps, every petty thing she does. If she keeps this up, we'll have enough to file a formal harassment complaint." I took Carl's advice. By the end of the day, I had ordered a set of cameras online. While I waited for them to arrive, I made a habit of photographing every notice Karen left on my door and jotting down notes about her visits. Part of me felt ridiculous, like I was preparing for some kind of suburban Cold War. But the other part knew I had no choice. Karen wasn't going to back off unless I pushed back. When the cameras finally arrived, I spent a Saturday afternoon setting them up around my property. They weren't anything fancy, but they do the job. One faced the driveway, another covered the backyard, and the third was positioned to catch anyone approaching the front door. As I finished the setup, a small part of me hoped the sight of the cameras would be enough to make Karen think twice. Spoiler, it wasn't. The next day, another notice showed up. This one was the most ridiculous yet. A threat of legal action if I didn't comply with the standards of the community by the end of the week. It was printed on HOA letterhead, but I knew it was all Karen. Her desperation was starting to show. By now, I had enough evidence to fill a binder: photos of Karen loitering outside my house, copies of her notices, and even a timeline of her harassment. Carl assured me we were building a strong case, but the whole situation was starting to wear on me. I moved here for peace and quiet, and instead, I'd been dragged into a battle of wills with a woman who seemed determined to make my life miserable. The first sign something was wrong came early one morning when I stepped outside to take out the trash. My backyard gate, which I always kept locked, was wide open. The lock lay on the ground, its shackle cleanly cut. My heart pounded as I glanced around, half expecting someone to still be there, but the yard was empty. Instinctively, I checked the security cameras. The footage from the night before was grainy, but clear enough to show a shadowy figure moving through my yard. They wore a hoodie obscuring their face, but the stature, the posture, it all screamed Karen. I called Carl immediately. "This isn't just harassment anymore," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "She broke in." "Good," Carl replied. "Not good that it happened, but this is the kind of evidence we need. File a police report. This just crossed the line into criminal territory." That same day, another notice appeared on my door. This one accused me of unauthorized structural changes to my property, whatever that meant, and came with an outrageous fine, printed in bold letters. The kicker? It was signed by Karen, using the official HOA letterhead. Carl confirmed what I already suspected. The fine was fake. Karen was fabricating documents to pressure me into compliance. But Karen's web of control didn't stop at me. In my growing frustration, I started digging deeper, talking to neighbors who seemed equally fed up but too afraid to speak out. That's when I uncovered the real story. Karen wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was using her position to broker shady deals. She had been pushing homeowners into unnecessary renovations, then funneling the contracts to her brother-in-law, a local contractor. The more I learned, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about me anymore. Karen was exploiting the entire neighborhood for her personal gain. Armed with everything I'd collected, camera footage, fake fines, testimony from neighbors, I decided it was time to take action. Carl helped me draft a formal complaint, which included allegations of trespassing, forgery, and abuse of power. But I wasn't stopping there. If Karen thought she could manipulate and intimidate her way to control, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. I called for a special HOA meeting, demanding Karen address the complaints. Word spread quickly, and by the time the meeting rolled around, the room was packed. Karen sat at the head of the table, clipboard in hand, wearing a smug smile that made my blood boil. When my turn came, I stood up, shaking but determined. I laid out every piece of evidence, the surveillance footage showing her entering my yard, the forged fines, and finally, the documentation tying her to the contractor. The room fell silent as I spoke. Even Karen's usual allies on the board looked uneasy. "You've been abusing your position," I said, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "You've trespassed, forged documents, and used this community as your personal ATM. It ends here." Karen tried to interrupt, her face red with fury, but the evidence spoke louder than her protests. By the time I finished, the board had no choice but to act. They voted unanimously to remove her from her position and launch an internal investigation into her actions. As I left the meeting that night, I felt a wave of relief. The battle wasn't completely over. Karen wasn't the type to go quietly. But for the first time, I felt like I had won a meaningful victory. And I wasn't alone. The neighborhood, once under Karen's thumb, was starting to find its voice. Karen's reign of terror came to an end that night. The HOA board's decision to remove her as president was just the beginning. In the days that followed, Carl worked with local authorities to file a civil lawsuit against her for property damage and forgery. With the evidence we'd collected, there was no room for Karen to maneuver. Her smug confidence had turned into something resembling panic as the community she once controlled began to turn against her. The lawsuit hit her hard. It wasn't just about the fines or the damages. It was the public spectacle of it all. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years started sharing their own stories. Karen's meddling, her manipulations, her under-the-table deals, they all came spilling out. Suddenly, the woman who once ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist found herself the target of whispered conversations and cold stares. Within weeks, Karen put her house on the market. I watched from my front porch as a for sale sign went up in her yard, the ultimate symbol of her defeat. By the time the moving truck arrived, I could barely muster a shred of sympathy. She had brought this on herself. As she drove away, the street seemed lighter, freer. The neighborhood, once suffocating under her control, began to come alive. People were smiling again, chatting over fences, and even stopping by to thank me. It was strange to think that my fight against Karen had not only protected my own home, but had also restored a sense of community that she had stolen. Looking back, I realized how close I'd come to letting her win. Standing up to someone like Karen took a kind of resolve I didn't know I had. But as exhausting as it was, the victory was worth every sleepless night, every stressful call to Carl, every battle in that HOA meeting room. I had protected my home and shown that no one, not even a self-proclaimed queen like Karen, could trample over my rights. The lessons from this experience stayed with me. Sometimes, peace doesn't come from avoiding conflict, but from facing it head-on. Karen was gone, her reputation in shreds, and I finally had the quiet, peaceful home I dreamed of. And for the first time in months, I could sit in my backyard, coffee in hand, knowing it was truly mine. With Karen out of the picture, the neighborhood finally started to feel like the haven I had envisioned when I first moved in. The constant tension, the surveillance, the petty notices, gone, like a dark cloud had lifted. For the first time in months, I could sit in my backyard without glancing over my shoulder or wondering if I'd find another bogus fine taped to my door. The victory was satisfying, not just for me, but for the entire community. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down began to open up, sharing stories about how Karen had manipulated or intimidated them in the past. There was a sense of collective relief, like we'd all survived a storm together. It felt good to know that standing up to her hadn't just protected my own rights, it had freed everyone from her grip. Still, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little cautious. Karen might have been forced out, but people like her don't disappear quietly. There was always the possibility she'd try to stir up trouble from a distance or find some way to retaliate. That's why I kept my cameras up and made sure Carl and I stayed in touch. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. If Karen, or anyone like her, ever tried to pull something similar again, I'd be ready. But those thoughts didn't consume me. Instead, they became part of a quiet resolve, a reminder that the peace I'd fought for was worth protecting. Every time I looked at my yard, at the freshly painted fence and the blooming hydrangeas, I felt a deep sense of pride. I hadn't let someone else dictate how I lived my life. This was my home, and no one, not Karen, not anyone, would take that away from me. In the end, the experience taught me something invaluable. True peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the ability to stand firm when your rights are challenged and to reclaim what matters most. My little house on this quiet street was no longer just a place to live. It was a symbol of everything I'd fought for and won. And now, as I sit here, with a cup of coffee and the sun setting over my little patch of earth, I know one thing for certain: this is home.